their mindset has to be different when it comes down to leading a virtual team or engaging people when you're not in person.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Patrich Calhoun, a client director for the Leadership Development Division at GP Strategies. Patrich, it's great to have you on the show.
Jeremy, as well, it's great to be on the show. I'm looking forward to the topic. It is something that, of course, as you know, is very popular. It's not new.
And of course, we are talking about the exciting new world of the hybrid workforce. So, first, because that's kind of a new term, as you say, it's been around, but people are really hearing it a lot these days. As I understand it, is in companies where some employees are in the office and some are working remotely. Is that accurate? Is that how you understand what hybrid workforce means?
Yeah, it is. And what's interesting is that I've read somewhere that roughly about 75% of employees are quote unquote deskless, right? And so most people get confused with when you're remote, it's work at home, but it's not really work at home, it's just remote work.
Right, that's true. That's a good distinction. And of course, that's been true, as you mentioned, long before we ever heard of COVID, right? There were always people who were out in the field. And for that matter, some people who did work remotely worked at home, not as many as have during COVID and probably will going forward. But still, this is not a brand new thing, but it's something that is facing a lot of companies in a way that's probably magnified these days.
It's interesting you make the comment that it's been around before COVID. And field employees, they're remote. They've been remote and they've had to be remote. In most cases, they don't have an office unless it's at home. I think the issue now has been uh, individuals that are static inside of an office space and trying to determine, how you create the environment that a field employee has to be able to continue to be productive, right? And so that's been one of the things I've noticed in listening to some of the clients that I speak with on a regular basis.
Okay, so tell us about that. You've been talking with folks in all sorts of different industries. So what are you hearing from leaders about the challenges of managing a hybrid workforce these days?
Leadership is one of the things that is often a challenge, and there are so many layers to that, right? But the one thing that I hear on a regular basis as it relates to the leadership individual, clients are saying, how do we prepare our leaders to lead in a virtual world, right? In a remote world. It's a very difficult. I mean, we used to say, um, in my field sales days when I was a leader in the field sales organizations, we would always say, you lead them by the whites of their eyes. Well, that's a little difficult now, right? And you have to do it over video if that's the possibility with the remote environment. So they often talk to me about how do you do it? You've got experience. How did you do it? And what types of skill development do we need for our sales leaders or leaders in general, right, to be able to support a remote environment? And so that's one of the things. The second thing is that of coaching. How do we coach them, right? A big part of ensuring that an employee is healthy and happy inside of a role is the coaching component, and whether or not our leader is spending time on truly developing them in space, real time. And so, and then finally, I would have to say is, you know, although there's a question about productivity, and I think all the studies show that productivity gains has been blown out of the ceiling here. We're getting great productivity from folks, but we're also burning them out. And so they talk about how we can leverage leaders or individuals in the organization to help. One of my colleagues call we've just completed the first act. Uh, there's a second act to come, and we need to be ready.
There's a lot to unpack there. As I hear it, one is as you mentioned, leading by the whites of your eyes, which I take to mean leading in person, right? Being in the same room with people and having that human contact, and having to shift to a model where you're still talking to people, but it's mediated through a screen. So that's one issue. And then the other is the burnout that you mentioned. So let's get into both of those a little bit. Let's first talk about the specific challenge of not being in the room with people, because you can still do coaching, right? You can still have the same basic kinds of conversations that you would have when everyone's in the office. So it's not as though you're never seeing them, right? And with our amazing video technology, you can literally see people and get a whole bunch of people on the screen. What more specifically is the issue there? I mean, we've all heard of Zoom fatigue. Maybe that's part of it. But what's your take? What's the particular challenge when you are not in the same building, when you're not in the same room?
They have to mindset. Their mindset has to be different when it comes down to leading a virtual team or engaging people when you're not in person. And so often we take advantage of the in person and opportunity. There's a lot of collaboration and camaraderie that happens. There's a certain human connection that happens in person that is often difficult to establish over video. And so it's important that individuals that lead in those spaces be prepared with the right levels of conversation. Um, think about different things. There's ability to be agile in your engagement. You have to also be inclusive. Because one of the things that video takes away from you is that sense of inclusiveness. Right? It actually does, and most people think that it provides more, but it actually takes away from the inclusiveness because you're right there with the person physically, and so they can feel a lot more inclusive. You can be a lot more intimate in your conversation, and you're not up against the clock. We often don't watch the clock when we're face to face with one another, but on video, if you notice, you know, I got a client that if you've got to get it done in 25 minutes, but if it were in person, they wouldn't mind giving me an hour.
Even in person, right? With a typical meeting, there's some time limit on it, right? Okay, this meeting is set for an hour or whatever. But I hear what you're saying, and it sounds like you're raising an important issue in the issue of isolation, right? That if you're not in the same building or the same room with other people, it's easy to feel isolated if you're working from home, say, and you don't have colleagues around. Um, and as you're also saying, you're just missing that kind of the small talk element, right? Before the meeting begins, afterwards, just those little moments that can make a big difference. So what can leaders do to approximate that, or at least to recognize it, and to try to mitigate some of that isolation?
Well, the first thing they need to do is be in a position where they can listen and communicate well. I mean, that's automatic. Um, I think to go even deeper, um, if you could make the mission and the purpose of the organization part of the work, it will focus closer. It draws in a cohesion between the leader and the employee as well, or the organization and the employee. They get to collaborate closer, and it drives a level of um, common direction and purpose and thread. So it's interesting you call that that out about being isolated because remote work can be an island. And you can immediately, although you're very productive, you can be disconnected from everyone else. I have a client that explained to me that they were going back to work in September, and her biggest objection was the fact that she now has to drive, and she's going 2 days a week. She now has to drive an hour, right, to an hour and a half to get to the office, right, and an hour and a half to drive back. She's gotten used to that, using that hour, right, to be as productive as she possibly can. And so now the organization is actually giving that hour back to the commute. that they once owned. We talk about measurement all the time. Be curious to know if you can measure productivity, right? Once you return back to work when you've been in a remote, um, hybrid environment.
Well, it'll certainly be interesting to see, right, what that data show, right? That will productivity go up? Will it go down? Will it remain the same? Right? Because I think you mentioned earlier, and I think it's been a little bit surprising to a lot of folks that remote work has boosted productivity in a lot of industries, probably for the reason, at least one of the reasons that you just mentioned, that people are spending less time getting to work and going home, and they're using that time to work. Maybe that's one reason. I'm not sure there's been enough time to really, study it in depth. Well, let's talk about the other issue though that's related, because I think one of the critiques of remote work has been that you're always on, right? Because that there can be a sense of overcompensation, that, well, we have to make up for people not being in the office. Managers have at least perceived to maybe have less control. So there are fewer barriers between working and not working, which can lead to the issue you pointed out, burnout. So what's your take on that? How serious is this issue? What have we learned about it over the past year and a half or so of people working from home? And what can leaders do to help people not burn out?
Yeah, that is an interesting, and when you talk about earlier unpacking, that's that's a full suitcase of items, right? And so, uh, but I will tell you from just personal experience, and you called it. You're always on, right? It's pretty amazing. I deal with a client that's in Australia, and she's 14 hours ahead of us, right? It's 11 o'clock p.m. It's her bedtime, and she's like, "Sure, I'll jump on a call." I don't know how often she would have done that had we not been in this space, but and that's just a side note for you, is how interesting things have changed for us. But that burnout, it must be very serious, because majority of the organizations that I've spoken with have gone to flex time, and in addition implemented no meeting Fridays, which is another great strategy to leverage, which is there are no internal, you can meet with clients, but there are no internal meetings on Friday. And the goal is for you to use that day, right, to address all the things that you couldn't address Monday through Thursday, so that your Saturday and Sunday or your weekend can be leveraged for you and your family. Because most people tend to work, they catch up on the weekend, they'll sacrifice one of those days, and then the work week becomes 6 days versus the five. And so corporations are putting in a no meeting Friday, or no meeting one day a week, and they recommend that. The second thing is that they're recommending, after so many weeks, that you take days. And then I have a client that we talked seriously about it. I was curious to know what they were doing to help with burnout. They mandate a day off every 30 days. One day you're required to take it. They give it to you, but you've got to take a day, and you have to be offline. And if you're not offline, they won't pay you for that day, right? If you're online. And so it's pretty interesting that they implemented that, but it seems to work. People, the feedback in their engagements survey, um, pointed that as one of the highlights of appreciation, and being able to say, I don't mind working.
Very interesting. These policies, the no meeting Fridays, the taking a day every 30 days, is this new? Is this something that's been driven by COVID, or were these things that existed before?
Flex days are not new, and no meeting Fridays are not new, but they were usually reserved for executive leaders, because of the workload that most of them in the travel, right? I was one of those individuals at one time where, you know, I was told to immediately shut down the day I returned back home from a travel week or a travel spirit, period. My executive leader said to me, you need to shut down. It's been around for a while, but it's made its way down to individual contributors.
So it would seem to me that another possible issue of a hybrid workforce is that you end up having two separate groups of employees, one in the office and one not in the office. And that if you're not careful, these can sort of there can be a division created where one group where there are two separate groups that don't really communicate and that don't see themselves as kind of on the same team, which obviously if you're a leader you don't want that. So first of all, is that an issue you're seeing, and if so, what can leaders do? How are leaders dealing with that?
That's an issue that I've seen for a long time, right? It's more apparent now, right? Because you have this pendulum swing, right, that happened with remote work, and because of the pandemic. But one of the things that I've noticed we've done, and I'll just use us as an organization, GP Strategies. One of the things that GP Strategies is very it's on the forefront and adamant about, and we advise clients to do this, is to, when I talked about making mission, the mission of the organization, purpose, make it part of the work, that that forces you to draw in build collaborative teams by having some collaborative projects, designed for completion, where you would normally assign one particular project, a particular project to one person or group. You build a project team so that they work together, have deliverables. Not only that, you now have, quote unquote, you creating bench strength within the team, right? Because now others learn aspects of work and business that they would normally do in a vacuum.
Mm.
And you have some good thought leadership that happens, but you also have some good development amongst team members.
And do you mean specifically that you put teams together, some of whom are in the office, some of whom are remote, and you kind of put them in a situation where they have to collaborate, have to work together, and that's one simple and pretty direct way of just saying, "Hey, you're going to work together. Doesn't matter if you're in the office. Doesn't matter if you're home." Is that what you're describing?
Yeah, you create missions, and by creating missions, we recommend it at GP Strategies for all our clients inside of the learning environment. The way you get individuals to learn from each other, co-create, you create missions. And so organizations, believe it or not, have a number of projects that are usually not accelerated because they have one or two people on the project. They don't have enough individuals to move it forward. So identify those priority items that need to be done. One, they need to be completed. They have, from an expedited standpoint, it doesn't hurt to have some insights from others, right? Both remote and in the office. In the sales space, we've been doing it forever, right?
Yeah.
As a sales professional, think about it. We're in the field. Everyone we engage with is sitting in the office. Our resources, our account receivable payables, our client facing customer support, we collaborate with them on engagements for sales. And it works, and we usually have success when we do it very well, right? So it's not hard to identify those opportunities where organizations, but we've just traditionally, as corporations, we've just always operated as that's a part of your role and your task, and we want to see you complete it. Where you never know, it could be beneficial to bring in remote and
Hmm.
in office individuals.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point. That in most industries, there are, depending on what role you're in, it's natural for you to be in the office, or if you're in sales, say, and you're out in the field, it's natural for you not to be in the office most of the time. Um, Although I would say this situation seems a little bit different in that in a given hybrid workforce, now you're dealing with some people who choose to remain remote, where they could be in the office, but they prefer to be remote for whatever reason, and others who prefer to be in the office, and they might even be doing the same job or similar jobs, right? So that there it's, it's a little bit, I would think it's a little bit different than sales, where, well, in order to do your job, you have to be driving around and out in the field. I think that leaders would need to be careful about even resentment amongst team members, saying, well, why do they get to stay at home? Or I wish I could stay at home, but I can't because of XYZ, and they're not here, and so on. So, how can leaders go about, well, let's say we're not talking about sales. How can leaders go about in this new paradigm, just reinforcing, kind of getting ahead of those kind of problems where those who are not present in the office are sort of, out of sight, out of mind?
Yeah, and we talked about it earlier. The stigma on remote work, right, is is no work, right, and that's unfortunate because that's not always the case. I think organizations are required to have refined outcomes that they are looking for from each individual. I think you've got to put some measurement and metrics in place to measure completion of said task if it's specifically particular to an individual. I think once you're able to do that, then I think you create the level playing field, right, where people in office and or at home are held to the same level of expectation
Hmm.
from a performance standpoint and outcome. Um, and I think that's a hard thing because those things can become emotional, and it's not. It's really just logical to your role. And I think organizations need to empower leaders with those things that the leader should not be in a position, and we talk about this, I talk about this constantly with organizations. Your leaders shouldn't be the deciding factor of what should be measured, right? Your organization should draw that down and say, look, regardless of an individual, if they're at home or in the office, they have a particular role. There's a certain level number of key performance indicators that
Hmm.
we measure against, and let's stay focused there. And once we stay focused there, then we're able to measure the level of impact everyone and performance that everyone is delivering upon.
Okay. So, in other words, as long as everybody's pulling their weight and you're transparent about that, then you can mitigate. Well, he's at home and I'm in the office, and it's just we're all on the same team. We're all pulling in the same direction. As long as everyone's doing their job, that's what matters. What's the main takeaway for our listeners who are concerned about managing a hybrid workforce?
I think you have to focus on providing employees with tools to to not just work remotely, right? And that was the you think about it, that was the big push. How do we get people home, right? Let's get them set up, the network. There's more to that. There's tools and strategies that need to be required for employees to be successful in a remote and hybrid environment. And I think I would recommend that. For me, I'm noticing because everyone thought about how to make sure we continue to keep the business moving, right? But make your focus people centric.
Absolutely. Right. Excellent advice. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for your insights and for your time and for a great discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeremy.
This webinar is brought to you by GP Strategies.
Together, we can create a world where business excellence makes possibilities achievable. You can access more webinars or download additional resources at gpstrategies.com/resource-library.